This is the start of a weekly podcast called Shep, Shower, and Shave. Each week, we're going to dive into some sports topics that we feel will interest you most. We'll debate, we'll welcome in distinguished guests, and take thoughts from you on social media on what else we can discuss as the show progresses. Today, my co-host Chad Shepard and I share your frustrations with the Tigers' closer situation. There's a key word, Chad, I think in sports called trust. And now we can use that in a lot of different scenarios in life. It can be parents and their kids. It can be a husband and a wife. It can be a boyfriend and a girlfriend. Trust is an easy thing to lose. It's a very difficult thing to regain. What you can't help but wonder now is if Brad Ausmus and really the entire Tigers team has lost trust in Francisco Rodríguez. You and I both know that fans have lost trust in him, and for good reason. This is done. They've got to move on. That's the easy part. Don't you think the difficult part is trying to figure out who's taking his place and when you make this change?
Absolutely. There's a lot of layers to this question, and I think that's part of what makes it such an interesting discussion. For Francisco Rodríguez, not only has he lost the trust possibly of his manager, possibly of his teammates, but the management, the fan base, the other guys out in that bullpen. There's so many layers to this, and whose trust really matters the most in that situation. Fans have lost teammates' trust before, or athletes' trust before, and full teams have lost their fan base for some time. But that's when you got to lock in. In the locker room, you close the doors, you worry about who's in that locker room and who can help you win a game the next day.
Yeah, but you don't manage, and you sure don't general manage based on what fans feel. Fans lost trust in Nick Castellanos not too long ago, and look at how different he is. Fans lost trust in Justin Verlander when he was going through an injury. Look what happened. Fans had the utmost trust in Joe Jimenez. And we had never even seen him pitch. We had read about what he did in Erie. We had read about what he did in Toledo. We knew he would throw upwards to 100 miles per hour, so that's the guy everybody wanted. Guess what? He came up, and he was a disaster. People wanted Bruce Rondon quicker than probably he should have. He ballooned up 300 pounds in the offseason. And now look at he's back down in Toledo. I think the easy thing is to say, forget Francisco Rodríguez, move him back to some type of setup role or situational role, and he's done that before, and maybe regain the form. The biggest question that needs to be answered by Tigers and Tigers fans right now is who takes his place? Because if it's Justin Wilson, and Justin Wilson has been fantastic, we all know that. His Mays have been up and down. His Aprils have been outstanding in his professional career, at least in Detroit anyway. The question is, if you make him your closer, and remind people this, he's had 12 save opportunities in his professional career. He's closed the door twice. Who takes the eighth inning role? Because suddenly, with Francisco Rodríguez not being able to come through, here's what's happened. Justin Wilson moves to the closer role. Now, you've still got another hole to fill. Is it Alex Wilson suddenly taking over the eighth inning role? Francisco Rodríguez being the seventh inning guy? At what point do you lose his confidence and you have to eat the rest of his contract knowing that you're already eating two relievers who are not on your team, eating their contract, and many people feel like you should eat a fourth in Aníbal Sánchez? This is an absolute worst-case scenario for the Detroit Tigers right now.
No, absolutely, and you talked about the different types of trust. How about trust in himself for Francisco Rodríguez? His quotes the last couple of days have been a little bit different than where they were before. Brad Ausmus had been publicly supporting him before. Now that's not so much the case. He's saying, we're going to go back, we're going to take a look at things, and we're going to reevaluate, and that's exactly what you have to do because you have no time to waste. Tigers fans understand you have no time to waste. It's a 162-game season. It's a long year, but we saw with how close divisional races have been in the past, you really have you got to get it right now, and there's only so many options. So if you do move up Justin Wilson, you create that hole in the eighth inning or maybe earlier. Tiger starters haven't exactly been pitching really deep into games this year. They're not giving us the encouragement that we don't need more bullpen options. If I'm Al Avila, I was probably shopping for bullpen options before this blow up even really started.
Right, it's a good point. Last year, Francisco Rodríguez blew 5 games in 61 appearances. This year, he's blown 4 games in 12 appearances already. Rodríguez still believes in himself. Now, you would expect athletes to say this. He says, obviously the numbers I've put up the last 6 weeks have been horrible. At the end of the day, I just hope they don't give up. In other words, he hopes people in the Tigers organization don't give up on him. He says, because I don't want to be judged on the last 10 outings of my career for what I've done the last 15 years. That's where I call a timeout. Just because you've been in the league for a long time doesn't mean that it's time for you not to go when you're struggling. Let's use Peyton Manning, for example. What Peyton Manning did at the beginning of his career and the first 10 years of his career are totally different than the last year he put up in Denver. Now, they won a Super Bowl, a lot of it because of him, but mostly because of the defense. I don't think you can look back at Francisco's what appears to be a Hall of Fame career, 437 career saves, and say, well, look, all the things he's done in his career warrant us to stick with him. At some point, there has to be a cutoff point. And when Detroit is last in the league in ERA, when they are last in bullpen ERA as well, and you're looking at a situation with Francisco Rodríguez that I think is most troubling is this. We can talk about the blown saves all we want. Closers, sometimes we look too deep into numbers. Bottom line is, he's got a whip of over 2, Chad. Teams are batting .350 against him, and he's already given up 4 homers in only 11 2/3 innings. Those numbers are despicable for a closer.
No, you're absolutely right. He's supposed to come in and get his job done, get those 3 outs. He's obviously not even getting that done. 13 appearances, 11 2/3 innings. He's given up 19 hits in that span. He's just getting knocked around. We're missing some of the elements that made him a swing and miss pitcher in the past. Part of that is locating down really low in the zone.
Yeah.
He's left a couple balls up, and the velocity is just not the same.
Okay, let me ask you this. When you look at a closer, I don't care who it is. Let's take Craig Kimbrell, for example, or Aroldis Chapman, for example, Wade Davis. You want strikeout guys. You want swing and miss types of guys. Wade Davis came in for the Cubs last night against the Yankees. He got 3 strikeouts in 1 inning. Francisco Rodríguez, and I know people in Detroit like to call him K-Rod because that was his nickname way back in the day. He's not a strikeout pitcher any longer, or at least with wipeout fastball stuff. His fastball tops out at 88. He's got a changeup that goes 86. He's not fooling hitters. That's the biggest issue that he's having right now. That's why you've got to have a guy who has a live arm in the 9th inning. You're only in there in a high-leverage situation to face what you hope will be 3 batters and maybe pitch 14 or 15 pitches overall. You need a guy with a fastball that will knock a guy out, flat and simple. Guys who throw changeups to try and get the job done, I don't think are good closers.
Wade Davis, Aroldis Chapman, those guys that really strike fear to the hearts of their opponents, Zach Britton, you're right. They have that wipeout stuff, and you don't have to go all the way up to 101 miles an hour to get to that.
Right.
But you do have to have the counterbalance, something that makes the changeup look slower, something that makes the curveball look that much nastier, the slider dip that much more.
Like Mariano Rivera had.
Exactly.
Like Willie Hernandez had here in Detroit in 1984. It wasn't much his fastball. It was a forkball for him that caused all kinds of problems. Francisco Rodríguez doesn't have that. So who's the 9th inning guy Detroit needs to go to then? It's got to be Justin Wilson because he's that strikeout guy for them right now. Where Francisco Rodríguez goes, I'm not quite sure. That's really up to Brad Ausmus and the rest, but we do know this. He spent part of 2011, 2012, and 2013 working as a reliever in different situations. Not a closer, but a reliever. It's got to be Justin Wilson at the back end. It's got to be Alex Wilson in the 8th, and it's got to be Francisco Rodríguez anywhere in between. Fair enough?
Absolutely. And another Tiger that you've talked about recently is Aníbal Sánchez. If you can't get something out of him very quickly in short order, you got to give that roster spot to somebody that's going to actually come in and provide some contributions to the team.
Well, that's easier said than done because, first of all, there's nobody who warrants some type of promotion. Second of all, you're asking, think about this for a minute. Al Avila's got to go to his owner, Chris Ilitch, who just inherits this club and realizes how much it costs, close to $200 million. He's got to go to him and say, look, I know I already asked you to eat a lot of money with Mike Pelfrey, and I know I asked you to eat a lot of money for Mark Lowe. Now I need you to eat the money that I spent, or Dave Dombrowski actually spent, on Aníbal Sánchez. And, oh, by the way, it's going to cost you $16.8 million this year and an additional $5 million for our buyout. We're talking about $24 million. That is a heap to try and ask a new owner to try and buy out. And now Francisco Rodríguez, who makes $6 million, might be on his way out as well. You're basically admitting this has been a failure on my part, and I may lose my job at the season's end.
Well, we'll have to look at how closely you can connect some of those acquisitions and some of that talent to Al Avila and what was inherited from Dave Dombrowski, like you talked about.
Well, we know Pelfrey was inherited. Al Avila signed Pelfrey. We know he signed Lowe, and we know he signed Francisco Rodríguez. So only one of the 4 guys that you're basically asking him to DFA, designate for assignment, in other words, waive, and hope somebody else picks him up, and I doubt they will. Only one of those guys was by your predecessor. You've done 3, and you've basically failed. You can't go to him and say, hey, guess what? I also signed Justin Wilson, and that's a big plus. I also signed Justin Upton, and that's been a big plus. Because for the most part, he is batting well below 500, and you want to be well above 500 in the general manager business.
No, you're absolutely right. But if Chris Ilitch wants to make this team a contender right now, or help this team remain a contender right now, and they recognize that window is closing, and they're going to go for it, you're either all in or you're not. No one said it was fair, or that it was going to be cheap, or that you wouldn't have to clean up any messes from the previous administration. Maybe this damages his relationship with Avila moving forward. We don't know about that.
Well, here's what we do know. Al Avila was part of the former administration. That's a big issue, too.
Absolutely.
See, if he's coming in off the street and he just says, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to make my own imprint on this franchise, I get it. He didn't do that. He was part of the negotiations that said, yeah, let's give Cabrera and Verlander an extension. Let's make sure we get this guy in the fold, including Aníbal Sánchez. Don't tell me he wasn't part of the discussions that says, I'll take Aníbal Sánchez instead of Max Scherzer on a long-term deal.
No one will deny that he was involved, but how much say he had is not easy for us to speculate on. Everyone, he was involved in the Mike Pelfrey signing, but everyone knows David Chad was the brain behind that. He wanted him when he was originally coming out into the draft, and he wasn't able to do that, and he was kind of reconnecting later in his career. John Fox is part of the Chicago Bears contingent that drafted Mitch Trubisky. He didn't know that was happening until the day of the draft.
Great point.
So it's not as easy for us to say from the outside exactly how much he had in that. Not trying to let him off the hook, though, in any way.
All right, there's one other big arm in that bullpen that we haven't mentioned, and that's Shane Greene. A lot of people feel like he is an ideal guy for the back end of that bullpen. I think you got to push the pause button on Shane Greene for right now, just because he struggles throwing strikes. It's one thing not having some type of wipeout pitch, and for Francisco Rodríguez, it used to be the changeup, and obviously it isn't any longer. It's another thing not getting ahead of hitters. Shane Greene struggles. He's about a 50-50 strikes to balls thrower. You can't have that as a ninth-inning guy, can you?
Right. Closers shouldn't beat themselves. He can get into situations where he beats himself. He gets a guy on base early. He leaves one up that gets smacked for a double. I think he can kind of populate the bases a little more quickly. K-Rod might not work so quickly coming out of the stretch, or his motions might be a little slow. He takes a long time adjusting his hat, but he has a routine, and part of that long routine and part of the success that he's been rolled into has been his comfort in that situation. He owns the mound, and there's a little bit of psychiatry involved between the hitter and the closer, and that's why when we talked about leverage earlier, he's losing leverage every day he blows another save against the guys in the other lineup. They're licking their chops if they know somebody's given up 8 earned runs in their last 9 appearances.
Why do we focus so much, and I think it's fair, the last couple of games against Francisco Rodríguez, but why are we not more angry at Jordan Zimmerman? By the way, another Al Avila signing. Why are we not more angry at Jordan Zimmerman for Saturday night's debacle in which he gave up 3 home runs and put Detroit in that type of situation in the first place? Why are we not more angry at a guy like Bruce Rondon? Bruce Rondon came in here and he was supposed to be the heir apparent, the next guy. This is what has disrupted, I think, a major plan for this team. This team's plan was to have Shane Greene, Justin Wilson, Alex Wilson, Bruce Rondon, Francisco Rodríguez. Bruce, one guy absent from that whole mix can cause a big jumble effect with that bullpen. Bruce Rondon comes in at over 300. He's a tic-tac away from being 350. And his ERA was 40.5. He had a whip of 5.25. Teams were batting 500 against him in only 3 appearances. He was an absolute dumpster fire. Why aren't more people upset at the guys who really helped cause this situation in addition to Francisco Rodríguez?
Yeah, I just want to put that into context really briefly, because Bruce Rondon, his body physically changed so much that his motion was no longer repeatable. I mean, that's pretty serious stuff where you're talking about the way your shoulder rotates, the way your upper body and your torso connects to your hips and your core. He's not able to repeat his motion. He lost significant velocity on his fastball. That's a personal health issue. That's a serious concern. So, you have concerns from that guy from his mental makeup and his athlete competitor standpoint. But that's an interesting question you raise, and it makes me wonder, is that something specific to Detroit where we're blaming K-Rod and part of the bullpen? And you could easily point the finger at Zimmerman and other starters. or is that something across the baseball landscape that's typical? And part of me thinks that the role that K-Rod was signed in here to be, with the history that the Tigers have had of trouble with closers and things like that, he came in to fill a specific role. And you don't want to use the word savior necessarily, but people kind of viewed him as, finally, we got it taken care of. That closer situation's been a nightmare forever. This guy's Hall of Fame bound. At least we got this on lock for the next few years. Zimmerman was a bigger signing in terms of price tag, but he was still a little bit of a question. Everyone knew he was coming off surgery. And Rondon has been, I'll believe it when I see it, for the last 5 years, it feels like now.
Right.
So I think some of that is the context with which that he absorbed that role.
I think you're too young to remember, but I can remember these types of issues being brought up way back in 1970, even though Tom Timmerman had a really good season. John Hiller was Detroit's closer in the early to late 70s. Mike Henneman was part of what we thought was a pretty good mix of a bullpen and closing the door. But Detroit has not been comfortable. I don't care if it's Troy Percival, Fernando Rodney, Todd Jones, obviously, Jose Valverde, Fernando Rodney again. Joe Nathan came here, and he had an outstanding season the year before he came to Detroit. And then he came here and was decent, but people never really gravitated toward him. Joakim Soria was fantastic with Texas before he came to Detroit. And then Francisco Rodríguez and the amount of saves that he has under his collective belt over his major league career. I get that he comes to Detroit at age 33, but it just seems like Detroit can't develop that closer that they've always needed or wanted to have.
And that's why I think some people have gravitated away from the development attitude towards it. Let's go out, let's spend the money, and they tried to do that in the past. I'm not saying they haven't gone that route, but let's get somebody who's a lock. But you're right, at this point it feels like Zach Britton or Aroldis Chapman could come here and their arms would fall off.
Right.
It's
well, they have drafted guys like Matt Anderson, for example, first overall. He just never worked out. They've tried to groom guys, as we mentioned, Rondon and Jimenez, and it just hasn't worked out. They've tried to take starters and made them closers, and that hasn't worked out either. I mean, for an example of that, all you got to do is, Jamie Walker, for example, is a guy like that. Jose Lima is another guy that you could talk about in that regard. I don't think it's unusual here in Detroit. I think it happens to a lot of different places. I think people in Boston get nervous with Craig Kimbrell. I think people in Cleveland get nervous with Cody Allen. I think people in Chicago nervous with Aroldis Chapman. So I don't think it's all that unusual. It just seems to be a constant theme for Detroit's bullpen more than anything else.
And part of the difference there is who they got behind them. You mentioned Chapman in New York. But if he goes down, Dylan Betances steps into that role. If Craig Kimbrell goes down, there's other capable arms in Boston. In years past, it had been Koji Uehara. I know he's somewhere else now, but there are other people behind them. With Detroit, it feels like we got one guy. It's a paper-thin last line of defense, and then beyond that, you're really scratching your head.
As we speak, relievers for Detroit with an ERA of 5.93 and teams batting .273 against them. The 5.93 ERA, not even close. By far the worst in the American League. As a matter of fact, Major League Baseball, the average ERA for a bullpen this year, 4.04 as we speak, and Detroit's is closer to 6 than anybody else's. Also a reminder, Detroit now with, 8 blown saves, 18 teams have 4 or less. Detroit has double that, believe it or not. Shep, Shower, and Shave, brought to you by Art Moran Buick GMC, 12 and Telegraph, and on the web, artmoran.com. Go see Art Moran, or Tom Moran and his staff to get the Buick GMC that is best fit for you and your budget. Let's shift gears. NHL playoffs. I know a lot of people aren't into it because of some of the teams that are involved. Oh, my goodness. How can Gary Bettman and the NHL really want Nashville into the Western Conference Finals? Why would they want a team like Anaheim or Edmonton? Folks, if that's your position, you're missing out on some of the best theater in sports right now. What Pekka Rinne has done for Nashville, what a story for the Predators to be where they are right now. Into the Western Conference Finals for the first time in history. They broom aside a Chicago Blackhawks team that everybody, Chad, thought was going to be the team to beat, and Pekka Rinne was simply spectacular when it came to that type of series. He carried them to the series sweep over Chicago, led the league in postseason wins, save percentage, and goals against in the postseason. Just the 4th goalie to ever boast a sweep, and at a goals against of .7 against Chicago, where he made 123 of 126 saves. They just knocked off the Blues. And I think it really took Nashville some time to get acquainted and used to P.K. Subban because of the trade with Shea Weber. And he comes in, and they had to divvy up some of that power play time and some of the penalty killing time. I think he's been outstanding. I know he makes some mistakes, but I think he's played with aggression. He's given them that type of edge that I think they needed. And I'm really happy about the story that is formed now in Nashville and them getting to the Western Conference Finals. I don't know if they can beat Edmonton. I don't know if they can beat Anaheim, but I think it's a really cool story what's developing in the West right now.
Absolutely, and I think what's cool about that story is they've really stuck true to the Nashville model that they built. Obviously a huge pivot point last year with Shea Weber being traded for P.K. Subban, and I'd be curious to ask Subban, do you feel more pressure now that you're the guy in Nashville and that they traded away the face of the franchise? Because there's no real parallel to what Shea Weber was in Nashville. From day one of that organization, he's the face of everything. And I wonder if Subban feels more pressure now that he's the guy in Nashville replacing the mayor, basically, or back when he was in Montreal, the hockey mecca of the world, trying to push that team through the playoffs as well. He's led an exciting and an energizing style of play that still, the defense that Nashville's been known for is still present, but they're able to score at a higher rate. They're shutting down really high-octane offenses like Chicago, and I wonder if Chicago is a little tired after the years of deep postseason runs they've had. But you're right, Nashville's as exciting.
Well, their depth was tested too, and I don't think it came through like many people thought it would.
Sure, but their top-end scoring just wasn't there where they had been really reliable.
Neither was St. Louis. I mean, look at Tarasenko. I think he only had 2 goals in one of the games. I think it was Game 5. Outside of that, where was all the high-flying St. Louis Blues offense?
That's fair, but I don't know that St. Louis was known for the same type of offense in the regular season that Chicago was. So part of their calling card, you were expecting those higher goal totals. But back to Nashville, you still have Roman Josi there patrolling the blue lines. You still have a good young core outside of P.K. Subban, a couple younger players. They play with an edge. They play physically. They control their opponent's shot attempts, and they're effective on special teams, and that's a good formula in the postseason.
All right, they get either Anaheim or Edmonton. They'll play a Game 7. Edmonton really showing you something with a 7-1 win in Game 6 to force those 2 magic words in Stanley Cup playoff, and that is Game 7. And they did it without Connor McDavid even registering a point. Unbelievable effort on the part of Cam Talbot and the Oilers. I think it's a great story, too. I think Ryan Getzlaf's been one of the best players, along with Evgeny Malkin, in this year's postseason. I can't wait for Game 7 against the Oilers and the Ducks.
He's been absolutely dominant, Getzlaf has, and they've tried a couple different line combinations, moving Corey Perry up and down with him. Richard Reichel, I believe, if I'm saying his name correctly, is a guy that scored for them and probably will continue to do so. But Anaheim is built really well. They've tried to make these deep postseason runs in the past. They've been thwarted by San Jose, by other teams in the West, L.A., in their own home state. And finally, this seems like the year that they can push through. They got to get past Game 7 against Edmonton, though, and what poetic irony it would be if it was the young, up-and-coming Edmonton Oilers, who are a little bit ahead of their time, ahead of their projection, stopping Anaheim in a team that kind of feels a little bit like the Tigers in baseball. Seems like their last shot with the group that they have.
What's wrong with Washington and the test that they get against Pittsburgh year after year? They will play tonight at the taping of our broadcast. And, I understand that they got some big play out of Alexander Ovechkin in the last game. Where's that been throughout the postseason, but specifically against Pittsburgh? Why is he a -1 in the playoffs? What is it with Alexander Ovechkin that won't allow him to play at his regular season height?
It's an interesting conversation, and you saw Barry Trotz had comments for him a couple games back that said, our best guy's got to be better.
Right.
And he's holding him accountable. Ovechkin took the blame, I believe it was Game 5, and he held himself accountable for a bad penalty taken towards the end of the game that helped Pittsburgh, seal what they did. Personally, I think Pittsburgh's playing a little bit, head and shoulders. They're kind of above everybody else from an offensive perspective. They're a high-flying team. They zoom around the ice. They put pucks in the corner, and then they're on you like that. Washington, I think, has a little bit of trouble with that, and I think it puts them on their heels at times. It's difficult from an Ovechkin perspective and an Ovechkin legacy perspective to think about how he can never get over this hump and still be viewed in the light that most people view him in right now.
One of the best stories right now is Jake Gensel. I mean, here's a guy who had 16 goals, 33 points in 40 games, and how he joins guys like Mario Lemieux, Wayne Gretzky, and Maurice Rocket Richard as the only players in history to have 8 goals in their first 9 career playoff games. It's amazing what he's done with Pittsburgh right now. And overall, 10 games, and he's got 12 points. He's outperforming Alexander Ovechkin. Sidney Crosby has been hurt. He's missed a game for Pittsburgh, and yet he's got 12 points. These guys are the reason. Gensel, obviously not in the same conversation as Ovechkin. He's one of those, hey, this is a Cinderella story that oftentimes happens in the Stanley Cup playoffs. But if people want to know who the best player in the world is, all you got to do is watch Sidney Crosby play and the guys who are on his line and how much better they get.
Right, and I'm not suggesting that everyone thought Gensel would have done what he'd done, but at some point the Cinderella label for some of these guys, when they do it year in and year out, might not apply. They had Brian Russ come up last year, and they had other young players. Connor Sheary's a player that's rolled into that lineup in the last 18 months or so since they made the coaching change. Those are the kind of things that you think about when you think about an organizational perspective. They're building guys so that they're ready to hit the ice running when they reach that NHL level, something that we were used to seeing from the Detroit Red Wings around this town. But what's interesting about Washington is, the way they're built and the way the Pittsburgh is built. And I think Washington earlier in Ovechkin's career tried to match what Pittsburgh was doing. Yeah. You're not going to outskill Pittsburgh. You're not going to outskate Pittsburgh the way that they're built right now. That's just how it is. They're top 6, they're top 9. The forwards, I think, are too good. So Washington has kind of shifted, and when they hired Barry Trotz, they kind of shifted the perspective away from Adam Oates, away from the offense-heavy stuff. They're trying to fix the special teams, yes, but they're being more responsible defensively. I think Pittsburgh really, really frustrates them because they try and focus on that, then they still get beat. They're getting numbers put up behind them, and they lose it on the offensive.
Don't you think the Red Wings and Red Wings fans really now need to take a really close look at the teams that are left, whoever advances between Anaheim or Edmonton, and recognize that down the middle, we always use baseball as an example of down the middle. Catcher, shortstop, second base, center field are so important. In hockey, the best teams, their best players are down the middle. Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin. We just talked about Jake Gensel. He's a center as well. Anaheim's best player, Ryan Getzlaf. Edmonton's best player, Connor McDavid, is a center. Anaheim's second line center, Richard Reichel. He's a center. Those are the things that Detroit has to build. They've got to get those guys right up the middle. I know they need more blue line help than anything else, but they've got to get some centers that are going to make everybody else better because they're going to be playing 200 feet, and they're going to go get the puck more often than the wingers.
I absolutely agreed, and they're going to support those more skilled wingers, and Detroit has a tendency to get those more skilled players on the outside, like we saw the way Tatar and Nyquist came into the organization. They were expected to be there on the outside, catch those chip passes from Zetterberg, finish their chances, and put up numbers. But the Red Wings are not willing to take too many hits on guys that are not as defensively responsible. Those are a couple guys where they did early in their careers. They conceded that they weren't going to be as responsible defensively, knowing that they'd provide that outside scoring. Now we're having low production returns on the outside scoring, and you have a team that's not as strong down the middle. Goaltending is also a part of being strong down the middle, and that creates an interesting situation for the Red Wings with the expansion draft coming and who they're going to protect.
Good discussion for sure. Baseball, hockey, we tackle it all here on Shep, Shower, and Shave. If you want to be part of the conversation, you can email us your questions, sheppodcast@gmail.com. We'll be back next week.